In this lecture video, we're covering hominin evolution from approximately 2 million years ago until today, which covers the genus Homo. This is the second in a two-part series on hominin evolution, and in part 1, we looked at the earliest hominin species, as well as the Australopithecus and Paranthropus species. You can find a link to that first video in the description. Let's go ahead and situate ourselves in time with this hominin family tree. Now you can get a copy of this family tree again through the link in the description so you can fill it in on your own. In part 1, we talked about these earliest hominin groups, including Sahelanthropus chadensis, which is the potential last common ancestor between us and chimpanzees, as well as the Ardipithecus species. We moved on to talk about Australopithecus and Paranthropus, including Kenyanthropus platyops. We also started to fill in this chart, which documents the various hominin characteristics for each of the main genera. So for Australopithecus, we see big teeth, small brains, and in general low food quality. Paranthropus takes this and goes to the next extreme with very large teeth, small brains, and inferred very low food quality. Throughout this video, we're going to be working through these species one by one, and then come in at the end to make sure that our chart is fully filled out. But it's worth mentioning right now that although for the last 2 million years, the archaeological and paleoanthropological record is more robust, simply because more fossils and more sites have been preserved, there are still a lot of questions over what exactly has happened in the last 2 million years. So we'll be looking to position a lot of species in time and space, but there's also going to be a number of unresolved questions as we go through. So let's talk generally about the features of the genus Homo. We see the first Homo appearing in East Africa around 2.5 million years ago, and of course the genus Homo persists until the present, with us, the Homo sapiens. Although we see an East African origin, it doesn't take long for the genus Homo to spread beyond East Africa, throughout the rest of the African continent, and then into the rest of the Old World. We see with the genus Homo significant encephalization, which is that increase in brain size. We also see teeth getting smaller, and that's because of a significant increase in the use and importance of tools. So as tool use becomes more common, we see teeth losing their position of prominence as sort of the main way of getting or accessing food resources. We're also going to be tracking these various Homo species through time on the left-hand side of the screen with this sort of timeline where we go back to about 3 million years ago at the bottom up until the present day. And this is so that we can help, we can appreciate how many different hominins there have been and coexisting over the last couple of million years. So we'll start out with Homo habilis. This is an East African group that appears around 2.3 million years ago, and in general, we're seeing a divergence away from the Australopithecus trends of having very ape-like postcrania and being very small, but we're still not seeing a fully human body plan at this point. So brains are still pretty small with Homo habilis at about 550 to 700 cubic centimeters. They're only about 4 feet tall. From the neck down, they still have a lot of apey characteristics, but they do have reduced tooth size that's more similar to modern-day humans. The name Homo habilis also gives us the nickname the handyman, and that's because when Homo habilis was first identified in the late 1950s, they were found in association with Oldowan tools, which are pictured on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. It was originally thought that Homo habilis were the first tool users, and the oldest stone tools of this Oldowan type are dated to about 2.6 million years ago. So this was seen as a defining characteristic of the Homo lineage, that we were tool users and everyone else was not. We now know that that is not a correct observation. We know that there are primates, including chimpanzees, who regularly use tools. And the discovery of Lomequian tools at 3.3 million years ago tells us that at least some Australopithecus groups were probably regularly using stone tools in East Africa. So that tool usage is no longer the defining characteristic of the Homo genus, but it's still an important part of the evolutionary suite. Next up is Homo rudolfensis. This is an East African species that's just a little younger than 2 million years old. We don't know a lot about this guy, but based on the fossils that have been recovered, it has a slightly larger brain than Homo habilis and large chewing teeth, but its position in the family tree is still a bit unclear. Our next group is Homo ergaster, and this is a really important one. The earliest Homo ergaster fossils appear in Africa around 1.8, 1.9 million years ago. With this species, we see reduced dentition and a really big increase in brain size, up to about 1,000 cubic centimeters. So this is really starting to take on the body plan of modern humans. The Turkana boy, pictured here, died when he was about 13 years old at 1.6 million years ago. It's estimated that had he lived into adulthood, he would have reached approximately 6 feet tall. So that's a big departure from Homo habilis at 4 feet tall. We also see with Homo ergaster the early controlled use of fire, perhaps by around 1.5 million years ago. Fire would have given our ancestors a lot of advantages compared to the groups that had come before. So not only can you use fire to see things at night and to keep yourself warm when it's a bit colder outside, fire helps keep predators away. It might also keep away bugs that are carrying diseases. But, the pretty obvious advantage to being able to use fire is that it helps you cook food. The ability to cook food would have given our ancestors an extra advantage in their foraging endeavors. Cooking food is sort of like pre-digesting. By exposing food, whether it's vegetables or meat products, by exposing food to heat and starting to cook it, it's starting to break down the tougher structures of either the cellulose or the protein so that when it gets into the body, all of those nutrients are more easily absorbed and utilized. It's thought that Homo ergaster probably was not out there hunting, it's not king of the jungle, but they were scavenging bits of animal meat and maybe also marrow or animal brains, so scavenging from the kills of other large predators. But they also probably made a lot of use of tubers, which are underground sort of root vegetables like potatoes or yams. And obviously, cooking a potato, it's going to be a lot more pleasurable to eat than a raw potato. So they were collecting more varied resources than some of their predecessors, and then using fire to make those food resources even more useful to them. Now, I've been talking about Homo ergaster, but of course listed here is also Homo erectus. Homo erectus fossils were first identified in East Asia in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it was very obviously a human ancestor with big brains and the use of complex tools. For many anthropologists at that time, 100 years ago, it made a lot of sense to them that you would find an early human ancestor in East Asia, because many people believed that the origins of humanity began in East Asia, and Africa was just not really part of the equation. However, in 1924, Raymond Dart discovered Australopithecus africanus in South Africa, and that helped reorient the discipline into the African continent. So what we see with Homo ergaster / Homo erectus is probably a single species that has dispersed over a really broad geographic area. One of the places where we see that dispersal is a site called Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia. The Dmanisi fossils are about 1.8 million years old, and until very recently, they were the first fossil evidence of hominins outside of the continent of Africa. With the Dmanisi fossils, you see a lot of variability in the physical features of the fossils. So it doesn't look like all, a group of individuals who all died at the same place, all members of the same community. There seems to be a lot of variety. And so we have this collection of fossils that have accumulated over time through maybe multiple passes of different groups moving through that area. I want to call your attention to this particular fossil because it's one that I find very appealing and interesting for a number of reasons. This is the old man of Dmanisi, and you can see that he has lost all of his teeth. But he didn't lose his teeth after death. They weren't teeth that just fell out after this person had died. This individual lost their teeth during their lifetime and survived for some time afterwards. And we know that because the alveolar sockets have been resorbed. So we know this person lived for some period of time after losing their teeth. I have to imagine that if this person lost all their teeth, they were probably dealing with some other health issues as well. But the fact that they survived shows that other members of the group were likely provisioning them. Other members of the group found it worthwhile enough to take care of this individual and keep them alive, even when they probably couldn't really do much for their own survivability. The early date of the Dmanisi fossils has allowed us to hypothesize on the first expansion of hominins outside of the African continent. We call this the out of Africa 1 migration, and the date of those Dmanisi fossils at 1.8 leads us to believe that this expansion or migration occurred pretty quickly after we see the emergence of Homo erectus or Homo ergaster here. So it's a pretty quick spread into Europe in the west, into China, and Indonesia in the east. However, more recent finds have suggested that there might be an earlier hominin presence in China at about 2.1 million years ago. Stone tools have also been identified that tentatively date to about 2.5 million years ago. So it's possible that there actually is something that precedes the out of Africa 1 migration. And again, as we continue to find more information, as we continue to find more evidence, these stories, these narratives will be reconstructed to better fit the data. And that's just good science, right? Okay, so here is our range of Homo erectus or Homo ergaster coming from this out of Africa 1 migration. And there are numerous places where we anticipate Homo erectus persisted for long periods of time. And so in East Asia, we see the classic Homo erectus continuing until at least 200,000 years ago, maybe 100,000 years ago. But let's talk about what's going on in Europe following the out of Africa 1 migration. And this is where things get a little bit confusing. So the first European species is Homo antecessor. Homo antecessor has been identified at Atapuerca, Spain, from two sites, Cima de Elefante and Grandolina, as part of this larger Atapuerca cave system. Antecessor appears to date from between 1.2 to 0.8 million years ago. And there seems to be evidence for cannibalism amongst some members of this species. So some of the fossils that have been recovered of Homo antecessor have cut marks that are similar to the cut marks you would find on an animal that had been butchered by humans to use as food. We don't know why antecessor would have cannibalized members of their own species. In the modern world, cannibalism happens because of food scarcity in times of major crisis, sometimes for ritual reasons. So it's impossible to tell just from the cut marks found on these bones what the impetus was for cannibalism, but it does appear to have happened at least occasionally. Homo antecessor overlaps in time with this next species called Homo heidelbergensis, and some have suggested that these are actually just two variants of the same species. So Homo heidelbergensis might appear as early as 1.2 million years ago, or it might not appear until 700,000 years ago. It was first identified in Heidelberg, Germany, which is where we get the name Homo heidelbergensis, but there are also fossils recovered from Atapuerca, Spain. Now, the fossils of heidelbergensis from Atapuerca are found in a place called Cima de los Huesos, which is the pit of the bones. Essentially, it's a collection of heidelbergensis bones at the bottom of a deep pit. And again, the significance of those bones in the pit is up for debate. Whether they were intentionally placed there as a way of ritually disposing of the dead, or maybe this was just a trash pile, it's still uncertain. But perhaps we're seeing more complex, even symbolic behaviors at this early date. The Homo heidelbergensis fossils are found in association with Acheulean tools, so these nicer stone tools like hand axes, a little bit more complex than what we see in some of the earlier African hominins. Also found in association with Homo heidelbergensis are these 2-meter-long wooden spears from Schoningen, Germany. These date to about 400,000 years ago, and they're quite remarkable just in the fact that they've preserved for so long, but they also tell us a little bit about the technology that was being used at the time. They don't have stone points affixed to the ends, which is a feature that we see in later hominins, but they are sharpened and wood-fired to retain that sharp point. So these are almost certainly hunting armatures, and we can see from that that hunting goes back to at least 400,000 years ago in this location. Now, further complicating the story of heidelbergensis and antecessor a bit is the discovery of the broken hill skull in Kabwe, Zambia. So that's in more southern Africa. This fossil, or this suite of fossils, have been sometimes named Homo rhodesiensis, but many anthropologists argue that rhodesiensis and heidelbergensis are the same species. So this is something that needs to be worked out phylogenetically. We need to have an explanation for how we have this same species in two places if they're not sharing some sort of common ancestor. We know that erectus has moved out significantly prior to the period of time that these fossils appear, but how does that all fit together? Before we get to that, let's look at our last European species, Homo neanderthalensis, or the Neanderthals. This species emerges in Europe around 200,000 years ago, so around the same time that our species is evolving in Africa. They persist until about 28,000 years ago, and the full extent of their range, it's quite an impressive range, all the way from Western Europe into the Middle East and further into parts of Eurasia. Their behavior is very similar to early Homo sapiens in terms of the complexity of the tools that they were able to make. We know that they were hunting large animals and doing that probably with hand-thrust spears. However, they don't appear to have any use of symbols, which is an important element in human culture. Their brains are quite large, larger in fact than humans, which is an important element if we consider encephalization to be one of the characteristics of the hominin lineage that enabled us to survive and diversify and proliferate. This species had a very large brain, and yet they ultimately went extinct. So this also tells us that while large brains are important, just having an absolutely larger brain isn't the only important thing that promises survivability. Neanderthals also appear to be cold adapted. If we compare Neanderthal skeletons to modern human skeletons, we see that modern humans are long and lean, and that's because we have a tropical African ancestry. And so we're long and lean to let off body heat, whereas Neanderthals are short and stout and big barrel-chested in order to conserve heat. So that reflects the different environmental conditions that both of these species were evolving within. In the year 2000, archaeologists were working at Denisova Cave in Siberia, located here. In Denisova Cave, they found a number of artifacts, a few bones, and also a beautiful stone bracelet and other jewelry items. Based on the complexity of these items and also the late date at around 40,000 years ago, it was assumed that these were the archaeological remains of Homo sapiens, like us, and that this would have been an early example of Homo sapiens in this further reach of Eurasia. In 2010, DNA analyses were published on these small pieces of bone, which included a small finger fragment and also a tooth. The DNA revealed that these individuals were in fact not Homo sapiens. So the next thought would be, all right, maybe these are Neanderthals, right? That's the only other hominin group that's around at this period of time. But the DNA showed, no, these are not Neanderthals either. This was a completely distinct and previously undescribed group of hominins that we now call the Denisovans. So they don't have a solid species name because we don't actually have enough of their skeletal material to assign them a full scientific name. But we call them the Denisovans, and they're estimated to have existed between 400,000 years ago and 40,000 years ago in Eurasia. Based on their DNA, although we know that they're not human and they're not Neanderthal, it appears that they do share a common ancestor with Neanderthals. More recent excavations have produced this mandible from Tibet, and based on DNA recovered there as well, it looks like the Denisovans had a genetic adaptation to living at high altitudes, which of course if you're living in Tibet, this is the Himalaya mountains, the body needs to be able to utilize oxygen in a more efficient way. So this is an interesting discovery because it suggests that hominin relatives of ours have been living in harsh conditions for very long periods of time, and they were successful until very recently. All right, let's drop these groups into our map to try to figure out their relationships both temporally and geographically. So here we have the outline of Homo erectus / Homo ergaster coming from the out of Africa 1 migration. We start with heidelbergensis, rhodesiensis, and antecessor in Germany, Spain, and Zambia. Now, of course, remember that some people consider heidelbergensis and antecessor to be the same species. Others say that antecessor is the ancestor and that heidelbergensis is the descendant. But some say that heidelbergensis and rhodesiensis in Kabwe, Zambia are the same species. So how do we get this same species from here to there if we already have an ancestor population of erectus having moved out of Africa? Well, this perhaps reflects a second migration following out of Africa 1 that would have given rise to, started out as rhodesiensis, or rhodesiensis reflects a later group of the thing that migrated, and then that became heidelbergensis, in which case perhaps antecessor is a remnant of the erectus that came before, or if it's the same species as heidelbergensis, then it's just an early part of that migration into Europe. It's a confusing picture. Next comes the Neanderthals, which do appear to be a descendant of that migrating out rhodesiensis heidelbergensis. So once we see Neanderthals arising, they move throughout a lot of this part of Eurasia. Then we get the Denisovans in Siberia and in Tibet. And since they share a common ancestor with Neanderthals, and Neanderthals' ancestor is coming out of Africa as Rhodesiensis heidelbergensis, that means that the Denisovans are also sharing that ancestry coming out of Africa. So it appears that Neanderthals and Denisovans share an African ancestor more recently than the out of Africa 1 migration. Whew. We might call this something like out of Africa 1.5, although I want to be very clear, this is not a name that anthropologists use. This is just how I'm sort of conceptualizing it here, because we are going to see an out of Africa 2 later on. But what's very clear from all of these different groups that are being recovered is that we're not just looking at one single migration event. It appears that movement out and in to Africa occurred multiple times over the last 1.8 million years, or even before. So it's not a singular, everyone walk out of Africa and then do your own thing. Movement was happening in and out of the African continent for a long time. So after out of Africa 1, there's still a whole bunch that happens before we finally get to out of Africa 2. So let's talk about that next species, which are the Homo sapiens. That's us. We share a common ancestry in Africa about 315 million years ago. So all humans have this shared African ancestry. And these early fossils date from 315 at Jebel Irhoud. This is a relatively recent discovery. Prior to that, the earliest Homo sapiens fossils were from Ethiopia at a site called Omokibish, and following that, a place called Herto. Early Homo sapiens are incredibly variable within the African continent, both in terms of their anatomy and their behavior. So it's not that once Homo sapiens appear, everyone looks exactly the same, everyone's doing the same thing. There's a lot of localized adaptations and localized behaviors that are reflecting the environmental conditions or the demographic pressures of each of those locations, right? But here are the main early Homo sapiens sites. Herto, it's worth noticing, potentially has evidence for mortuary practices. There were 3 skulls recovered from Herto in Ethiopia that date to 160,000 years ago. And on some of them, it appears that the flesh has been removed from basically the scalp, so flesh taken off of the skull. And then there are some areas on the skull that almost have a polish built up on them. And it's interpreted to be from rubbing against animal hide. So the general interpretation of these skulls is that when those individuals died, members of their group removed all of the flesh and soft tissue from their skulls and stored them in some sort of animal hide bag. Maybe this was a way of, keeping your relatives, keeping your loved ones close to you if you were a forager who was not necessarily going to be returning to the same place year after year. If you don't have a cemetery, how do you honor your loved ones? Well, maybe you take them with you, and that's how you sort of keep their spirit alive. We don't, there's only so far we can reconstruct these behaviors and these intentions. But seeing mortuary practice, that's ritual behavior, that's symbolic, and it happens really early on with our species. Of course, behaviorally, we see a lot of really complex behaviors within the Middle Stone Age, which is a time period that runs from about 320,000 years ago until maybe 20,000 years ago in Africa. And this is when we see our species becoming this behaviorally and cognitively modern species that we are today. The first time some members of our species start to migrate outside of the African continent was about 100,000 years ago, and they make it into Israel at this period of time where there's a very warm climate. The remains of these early hominins can be found in the sites of Skul and Kafsa in Israel. But it appears that once climate started to change and it cooled down, those modern humans in that area were suddenly not as successful. They weren't able to adapt to the cold as easily as they were able to adapt to a new warmer climate. And so they either moved out of the area or they locally went extinct. I think this is an interesting point to bring up because it's a good reminder that although our species is very resilient, although we're very creative and innovative, we have not always been successful in our early attempts to expand throughout the world. So we see the first time that Homo sapiens start to extend beyond Africa, it's a bit of a failure, although there will be success later on. I should also mention that there are some earlier places around Eurasia that have been identified as early Homo sapiens locations, migratory spots. So basically places where humans expanded out of prior to this 100,000 year marker. So again, the more we learn, the more we might start to refine our understanding of how our species filled out the old world. But we can say that there was a major expansive event around 70,000 years ago, or by at least 70,000 years ago. And we call this Out of Africa 2. Out of Africa 2 took this African Homo sapiens and moved them west into Europe, east into China, and for the first time south into Australia. And along the way, we encountered other groups of hominins who were already occupying those spaces. So one of the questions that we have as anthropologists and archaeologists is, what happened when we encountered these other species? Did we fight? Did we ignore each other? Did we have babies? Well, one thing is for sure. We know that at least at some times, in some places, early Homo sapiens that were expanding into the old world, they did interbreed with these other hominin groups. So this brings us to one of the most interesting discoveries of the past couple of years, and that is the fact that Homo sapiens have mixed their genes multiple times with different hominin groups as we've encountered them on the landscape. So in this Out of Africa 2 migration, as humans are moving into the Middle East, they're meeting Neanderthals, and they're not joining groups, like it's not just a 50-50 mix of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but it does appear, based on the DNA that has been left behind, that Homo sapiens females would occasionally interbreed with Neanderthal males, and then those offspring would be raised within the Homo sapiens groups. And the same is probably true for mixing with the Denisovans, where human females were reproducing with outside males and then raising the babies within those groups. There's also some genetic evidence to suggest that a similar interbreeding has occurred in Africa, possibly around 35,000 years ago, with some archaic population of African hominin introgressing into the human genome. But we don't know who that was because we don't have any fossil evidence yet for what species that may have been. We just know that there is some outside DNA coming into that lineage. We can see the effects of these reproductive events in the genes of humans today. And so in this graphic, we see a comparison of Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA, and sort of the rates of how much of the genome seems to be contributed by Neanderthals and Denisovans for various populations around the world. Of course, Africa is pretty blank here because it doesn't appear that there's a lot of Neanderthal DNA in Africa or a lot of Denisovan DNA in Africa. But many people assume that as we get more data and as genetic research gets more refined, we probably will see some Neanderthal DNA in there, some Denisovan DNA in Africa, because we do believe that there has been a significant amount of in and out of Africa and not just a purely out migration. So as humans are moving out of Africa in the Out of Africa 2 migration, they make it into Europe by at least 50,000 years ago. These early Europeans are there during a period of time we call the Upper Paleolithic. People we refer to as the Cro-Magnons or sometimes cavemen, and we know that they're competing and interbreeding with Neanderthals. This competition was probably not physical competition, but rather competition for resources. And of course, ultimately, humans are the more successful species. Neanderthals go extinct and humans persist. Humans also make it to Australia by probably 65,000 years ago, moving along the southern coast of Asia, likely bumping along the coast of India, and they very likely were also using very simple boats. Once in Australia, those first migrants become effectively cut off from from the genetic pool of other Homo sapiens and stay relatively insulated. But these are our first civilizations of people. The first societies of people really form in Australia and persist for thousands and thousands of years. So Australia is a wonderful place if you're thinking about it in the context of early migrants out of Africa, and then how groups of people maintain their societies and remain successful over tens of thousands of years. So now that we have our humans spread throughout the world, we have just a few more species to cover, and these are all relatively recent discoveries. The first is Homo floresiensis, which was identified on the island of Flores in Indonesia and dates from about 50,000 years ago to 190,000 years ago. The really cool thing about Homo floresiensis is that these are dwarfed hominins. So they are much smaller than Homo sapiens that are alive today, like us, but also smaller than the species that they are inferred to be descended from. So perhaps Homo erectus, as Homo erectus spread from Africa into Asia and into Indonesia, perhaps some Homo erectus group got stuck on an island and then evolved into Homo floresiensis through this process called island dwarfism, where large species become small in these small constrained environments. And essentially the gene pool is getting smaller. So that happened with hominins. Here you see a reconstruction of what this tiny little Homo floresiensis would have looked like. It also happened with elephants. So elephants also became small when they were trapped on this island. Some anthropologists have suggested, however, that the morphology of Homo floresiensis is more similar to some of the hominins that came before Homo erectus, so perhaps Homo habilis or even an Australopithecus species. So maybe, as we were mentioning before, there are some finds, both fossil finds and stone tools, that predate the out of Africa 1 date that have been found in China. So maybe that suggests an earlier migration of some hominins, and perhaps it was those earlier hominins that descended or that then evolved rather into Homo floresiensis. Much more recently is the discovery of a group called Homo luzonensis from the Philippines. These guys date from about 50 to 70,000 years ago, and similar to Homo floresiensis, this might be a dwarf species. Now, there haven't been a ton of fossils published yet from this species, and certainly we will learn more as time goes on, but an interesting new addition to the hominin family tree at a pretty recent date. Our final group is Homo naledi, and this is a group that has been in the news a lot over the last several years. In 2013, some cavers discovered a little chamber in the back part of a cave in South Africa, and they could see that there were bones all across the bottom of that cave. Through a series of, talking to a friend and talking to another person, they got in touch with an anthropologist who's been working in South Africa for a long time, and he immediately was interested in seeing what these bones were, if they were something that fit into the hominin species that he had already discovered and been studying in South Africa. However, this particular cave system had some very narrow passages, and so he put a call out on social media asking for people who had extensive archaeological or anthropological excavation experience, people who were not claustrophobic, people who had experience with caving, and also people who were quite slim, because in parts of the cave it was necessary to squeeze through a spot that was only about 8 inches tall or 8 inches wide. So you'd have to be a very small person to get back there. A team was assembled of 6 women, and it's not surprising that it would be women who would end up being the ones to do this kind of work, because we know that humans are slightly sexually dimorphic, and so if you're looking for small humans, they're more likely to be women. These 6 women became known as the underground astronauts, and over the work of several months, they recovered the remains of at least 15 individuals from this back chamber of the cave. These fossils were given the name Homo naledi, and based on their physical appearance, they really looked like a kind of early Homo species, something similar to Homo erectus. They have this sort of forward, snouty face called prognathism. They also had pretty small brains, 450 to 600 cubic centimeters, which is not much larger than a Homo habilis brain, and much smaller than Homo erectus or Homo sapiens. So this was a remarkable discovery, although there was immediately a lot of debate around this. Was this just a Homo erectus group? Was it really some new species? What place did it fill in the hominin lineage? dating reports have been released relatively recently that have actually put a specific date onto these fossils. And this was a very surprising result. It looks like these fossils date to about 250,000 years ago, around the same time that our species was first evolving in Africa. This is a very late date for something that looks so primitive. And so, as interesting as it is, it also just opens up a lot more questions about, what significance do these fossils hold? At the same time that the fossils were first being published in 2015, there were some interesting interpretations about what the site was interpreted to be. So the authors of the report suggested that perhaps the chamber where all of the fossils were deposited were an intentional place where individuals of this group placed the members of their group that had died. It was essentially like a burial spot, except without being buried. But when someone died, they would be carried back into this final little portion of the cave, which, that's quite an interesting interpretation considering that it's such a small space that you would have to squeeze through. So to have to move a dead body through that small of a space seems like it would be pretty difficult. But also, when it looked like these fossils were about 2 million years old, that's a really early date for ritual behavior. And intentionally putting your dead in some space that seems to be special and only for the dead, that's ritual behavior. That's symbolic. And there's not good evidence for symbolic behavior that old. However, the fact that they're now 250,000 years old, that's much more within the range where we might expect to see some sort of early symbolic behavior. So this species still, there's a lot of questions surrounding it, but what a fascinating discovery in this really cool environment. And hopefully there will be more Homo naledi fossils and more evidence of their behavior coming out within the next couple of years so we can see how things vary with geography. Okay, now let's go ahead and fill in the rest of our hominin family tree to include all of the different Homo species that we've discussed so far. We've got Homo habilis, which appears in East Africa around 2.3 million years ago, Homo rudolfensis, and then Homo ergaster and erectus. And of course, Homo ergaster is where we see this big increase in brain size, also more complex tools and more sophisticated tool use, and perhaps more meat being included in diets. And this is also the species that we have the first well-documented expansion of hominins outside of the African continent. And of course, we call this the out of Africa 1 migration. From that out of Africa 1 migration, we have a real proliferation of species. So in East Asia, we see ergaster turning into this more erectus, like classically erectus, which persists until, perhaps 100,000 years ago. In Europe, we then see Homo antecessor and Homo heidelbergensis, and the relationship of these two depends on who you are. Some people might flip those two terms around. Those lead into Homo neanderthalensis, and then of course sharing an ancestor with Neanderthals are the Denisovans. So one way we think about this is either these groups are all coming directly out of the ergaster line, or maybe, as I suggested earlier in the video, there's a subsequent migration outside of Africa of heidelbergensis or antecessor, which is similar to what we see in Africa's Homo rhodesiensis, and then that gives rise to these species. So still, ambiguity around here. We need to keep working to resolve those relationships. But then in Africa, we see the emergence of Homo sapiens around 300,000 years ago. And this leads us to our second big migration, the out of Africa 2 migration. So although we know there's a lot of migrations happening both out of and into Africa through this time period, we've got these two kind of solidly earmarked ones that we know lead to a lot of the populations of hominins that we see at various points in time. Next up, we've got Homofloresiensis in Indonesia and Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. And then finally, to bring it back over to Africa, we've got that mystery group, that group where we see an introgression of genes around 35,000 years ago. So we know there's some mixing with those African Homo sapiens, but not really sure who this belongs to because it's a group represented only by DNA. However, the new identification of Homo naledi at 250,000 years ago, who knows, maybe this maybe these two groups are somehow, more closely related. And so the Homo naledi relationship will hopefully become more clear over time, and maybe DNA will come out of that one. So we see as Homo sapiens evolves and spreads, they're interbreeding with multiple other groups of hominins. This is a cool fact because it means there's not just one way to be human. Humans are and have always been a species that have expanded their gene pools when possible, and there's not just one singular thing that creates or identifies the stereotypical human. We are a diverse species, both biologically and behaviorally, and that is, that's our evolutionary legacy. All right, finally, let's fill in our hominin characteristics down here for the genus Homo. We see generally small teeth and generally big brains, with a couple exceptions, for example, Homo naledi. But in general, those big brains are what typify the Homo species, and of course, a higher food quality that comes to include much more the use of animal proteins and animal fats. So there we have our hominin family tree covering the last 7 million years of evolution. I hope what we've taken away from this is just the incredible diversity of hominin species that have existed over the last 7 million years, all of the different shapes and behaviors that are witnessed throughout this evolutionary period. There are still so many questions to answer about hominin evolution, and by this time next year, this video will be woefully out of date. That's a good problem to have. The more we learn, the more we hope to answer these questions, and then new questions will arise. And so the study of human evolution is really a testament to the power of science, where we test our hypotheses. And one of the ways we test is by going to find more data. We find more fossils, we find more artifacts, and then we try to test our original ideas to see if they withstand the scrutiny. And so as time goes on, hopefully the picture will be more refined, but certainly I expect we will discover that our species and our ancestors have been doing some really amazing and remarkable things for many, many thousands and millions of years.